You've probably seen some movie about mail-order brides in the Old West. Hollywood sold it as a love story. But Wells Fargo records and court cases from that time tell a different story. Women were listed in catalogs like merchandise, with prices that varied depending on their age and where they came from. Find out now 22 documented facts nobody taught you in school. Fact 1. Between 1860 and 1900, somewhere around 20,000 women headed out to the American West to marry men they had never seen in their lives. It all started with a newspaper ad. Newspapers from Boston to Chicago devoted entire pages to it. A man in the middle of nowhere would describe himself, promise land and stability, and wait for a reply. Many women accepted. The problem is what nobody published along with those ads. There was no oversight of any kind. No government agency tracked what happened to these women after they got off the train. There was no guaranteed right to return. There was no legal protection at all. They arrived, and from that point on, they were on their own. The practice was completely legal and treated like something ordinary. Nobody questioned it. Nobody investigated it. It was the kind of deal where only one side truly knew what they were getting into. Fact 2. In the 1870s, finding a wife in the United States became an organized business. Matrimonial agencies operated in cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco with a simple model. Men paid $5 to place an ad. Women paid $1. But the detail that really stands out is something else. For an extra fee, a man would receive a printed catalog at home with pictures of available women, along with their age, hometown, appearance, and what they called domestic skills. Historians who studied these materials noticed that the language used was almost the same as the cattle sale catalogs from that same period. The best-known agency, the Matrimonial Times, claimed to have a circulation of 50,000 copies and said it had arranged more than 1,200 marriages by 1880. And this was at a time when many people could not even read. Fact 3. In the 1870s, portrait studios were already offering what we would call a filter today. They slimmed waists, added hair, removed wrinkles, and smoothed skin. And it was not just a women's thing. Men did the exact same thing. Everybody wanted to make a good impression with that one photo that would travel hundreds of miles to the person on the other end. The problem came later. When the couple finally met face to face, many times neither one looked like the picture they had sent. Newspapers in frontier towns in the 1880s published letters from readers on both sides, complaining about the shock of seeing what the other person really looked like. This led to fights, people backing out, and even lawsuits. The lesson is simple. Wanting to look better than reality did not start with the internet. We have been doing it for more than 150 years. Fact 4. Once she signed the engagement contract, there was no turning back. A lot of people do not know this, but in the 19th century, that agreement carried the weight of the law. The woman accepted the travel money, signed the paper, and that was it. She was considered a fiancée in the eyes of the court. It was not just a handshake. It was a firm legal commitment. And if she arrived in town and decided she no longer wanted to get married, that was when the real problem began. The man could sue her for breach of promise. There are records of cases where women were forced to pay back every cent of the trip, money they simply did not have. Now, imagine the situation. A woman alone in a frontier town, not knowing anyone, without a penny in her pocket, no ticket back, and still facing a lawsuit. Saying no to the marriage was a right that in practice almost none of them could actually use. The law turned choice into a trap. Fact 5. On the American frontier, many men could not read or write. This was common. especially among miners, farmers, and lumberjacks who had spent their lives working with their hands. But those same men needed a wife, and the only way was to send convincing letters to women back east. The solution was to hire scribes, teachers, clerks, and even professional writers built a business around it. For a fee, they wrote romantic, well-written letters full of feeling. The woman on the other end would read them and picture an educated, sensitive man. When she finally crossed the country and reached her destination, she found someone who could barely sign his own name. Diaries from that time recorded this shock in detail. The woman had fallen in love with words that had never belonged to the man standing in front of her. It was a kind of fraud nobody punished, because technically no law had been broken. Fact 6. In Old West mail-order marriages, lying about age was basically part of the game. Women who said they were 25 were actually already past 40. Men who described themselves as middle-aged farmers were often already pushing 60. And no one could complain, because there simply was no law requiring someone to tell the truth before marriage. When historians cross-checked newspaper ads with census records in Kansas, Nebraska, and Arizona from the 1870s and 1880s, what they found was revealing. The average age gap between these couples was 18 years, with the man always being older. In several documented cases, that gap reached 30 or even 40 years. The couple only discovered the truth when they came face to face, often after weeks of travel. By that point, going back home was not always an option. Fact 7. The Old West killed men at an insane rate. Mines collapsed, diseases had no treatment, and violence was routine. Now imagine this. A woman spent months exchanging letters with a man on the other side of the country. She gathered everything she had, endured weeks of travel by train or stagecoach, and when she finally reached her destination, a neighbor showed up at the station to say her fiancé had already been dead for weeks. This happened more often than we imagine. Records from different territories document exactly this kind of situation. And the worst part? There was no kind of support. No one was required to pay for her ticket back. No government agency took responsibility. That woman was left alone with no money, not knowing anyone, in a place that barely had any law. Abandoned in a territory that did not even know she existed. Fact 8. The West killed husbands so fast that women became widows before they had even been married for a year. Mines collapsed, diseases had no treatment, and accidents were routine. The result was brutal. The demand for wives and husbands never stopped. Marriage records show men who placed ads looking for brides 3 or 4 times in the same decade because each wife died shortly after arriving. And the cycle did not stop there. Some of these women who came as mail-order brides became widows so quickly that they appeared in matrimonial newspapers again themselves, only now on the other side, offering themselves for a new marriage. It was a system that fed itself. The frontier did not just consume gold and timber. It consumed entire marriages at a speed that seems impossible to believe today. Fact 9. In Utah Territory, during the second half of the 1800s, some men placed ads describing themselves as hardworking, devoted settlers looking for a wife. What those ads did not mention was that these men were already married, sometimes to 2 or even 3 women. When the bride arrived after weeks of travel, she found out she would be just one more wife in the household. Polygamy was practiced by part of the Mormon community in that region, and many men simply left that detail out of the ads. The problem went beyond the initial shock. These marriages had a confusing legal status for decades, which meant that a woman who wanted to leave had almost no legal way to protect herself. In practice, She was stuck in a situation she had never truly chosen. Fact 10. In 1985, Congress passed the Page Act, which became the first federal immigration law in American history. And the reason may surprise you, traffickers recruited women in Guangdong Province, China, promising marriage to wealthy men in California. When these women arrived, they found out they were in debt to brothel owners. The law was created to ban the entry of women brought in for immoral purposes. But here is the problem. In practice, authorities applied the rule so broadly that almost no Chinese women could enter the country, not even legitimate wives of men who already lived here. That restriction lasted almost an entire century, only being reversed with the Immigration Act of 1965. A law made to fight trafficking ended up separating families for generations. Fact 11. Before marriage, many of these women were already living as workers without getting anything in return. Court records and diaries from that time show a pattern that repeated itself a lot. The woman would arrive at her future husband's property and immediately start cooking, cleaning, tending the crops, and even raising children from his previous marriages. The actual wedding kept getting pushed back with no set date. The man had no legal obligation to keep his promise. So he used this so-called engagement period as a way to get free labor for as long as he wanted. There are documented cases of women who spent an entire year in this situation. When the arrangement finally fell apart, she had already given months of hard work and had no legal right to demand any kind of compensation. It was a system that worked completely in favor of the person who already had the power. Fact 12. On an isolated farm in the middle of nowhere, 50 miles from the nearest town, there were no neighbors, sheriffs, or witnesses. And that is where things get heavy. Until the early 20th century, married women in most American territories could not own property in their own name, open a bank account, or file a lawsuit in court by themselves. Legally, she basically did not exist as an individual separate from her husband. Now imagine a mail-order bride arriving in rural Montana or Arizona, not knowing anyone, with no money of her own, no horse. To leave, she would have to cross 50 miles of rough land alone, with no resources at all. The abuse that happened in these places almost never showed up in the historical records, precisely because the victims had no legal way to report it. No record, no proof, as if it had never happened. Fact 13. Imagine signing a document without understanding a single word of what it says. That is exactly what happened to thousands of immigrant women who came to the United States from Scandinavia, Germany, and Ireland. They answered matrimonial ads published in newspapers in their native languages. Up to that point, everything seemed to make sense. But when they arrived at the American agencies, the contracts were all in English. No one offered a translator, and the worst part, some of these agencies had their own interpreters who worked for the agency, not for the women. Immigration records from that time show that many signed documents with clauses about debts, work obligations, and even giving up property rights. They had no way of knowing what they were agreeing to. It was not carelessness. It was a system built to work that way. Fact 14. Some women traveled for weeks only to be rejected right on the train platform. Imagine crossing the entire country, sometimes more than 2,000 miles, believing a new life was waiting for you on the other side. Now imagine arriving, and the man who promised to marry you simply turning his back. That is exactly what happened to women of mixed ancestry. Many did not mention their background in the letters exchanged before the trip. And when they got off the train, the fiancé would look at them, realize it, and call everything off right then and there. Anti-miscegenation laws, which banned interracial marriages in most Western territories, gave legal cover to that refusal. The man owed nothing, not a refund for the ticket, not lodging, not even a formal explanation. The woman was left abandoned in a strange town with no money and without knowing anyone. California and Nevada newspapers in the 1870s and 1880s recorded several of these cases in detail. Fact 15. In the 1870s and 1880s, a huge share of the men who placed ads looking for wives in the American West were already widowers. And here is the detail many people would never imagine. They often hid how many children they had. Territorial census data from that time indicates that more than 40% of the women who arrived as mail-order brides found at least 2 children already living in the house. Some were met with 5 or 6 kids, from babies to teenagers, without any of them ever being mentioned in the letters exchanged before the trip. In practice, many of these men were not looking for a life partner. They were looking for someone to take care of the house and the children. Letters written by these women described the shock of realizing that the marriage was actually a work contract in disguise. Fact 16. Diaries from women of that time reveal a pattern that stands out. After posting an ad looking for a husband, they would wait for weeks with no reply. The anxiety grew, other options disappeared, and hope started to fade. And it was right at that point, 3 or 4 months later, that a letter would finally show up. Coincidence? Historians believe not. Men who already had experience with these ads knew exactly the right moment to respond. They waited on purpose. The longer the woman went without hearing anything, the more willing she would be to accept any offer. It was a silent tactic, no threat, no direct pressure. Just time working in favor of the person controlling the pace of the conversation. And the most revealing part is that this pattern appears repeatedly in records from different regions, which suggests it was not just 1 or 2 isolated men doing it. It was a method spreading among them. Fact 17. In the 1870s, Wells Fargo created an internal procedure that very few people know about. Women traveled west with the promise of a marriage arranged by mail. When they arrived and met the man in person, many simply refused to marry him. This happened so many times that the company had to create an official rule offering a discounted return ticket. But there was a catch. The woman had to go to a Wells Fargo office and sign a sworn statement. In remote territories, the nearest office could be days away. So in practice, many were trapped in that place with no way out. The fact that a formal policy existed tells us something history books rarely mention. The number of women in that situation was large enough to become corporate bureaucracy. Fact 18. Some of these women ended up trapped in a cycle that repeated over and over. It worked like this. She answered an ad, traveled hundreds of miles, married a man she barely knew, and when he died, which happened often under those conditions, she was left alone. No family nearby, no money, no land in her name. What was left? Publishing her own ad in the same matrimonial magazines that had brought her there. Marriage records from Nebraska and Kansas in the 1880s show women who went through this cycle 2-3 times. And with each round, the situation got worse. She was older, had no property, and now had children from the previous marriage. That meant fewer interested suitors and worse bargaining power. The system did not throw these women away. It recycled them. Fact 19. In the 1870s, the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts worked like traps. Women worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and earned between $250 and $350 a week. But that money barely even made it into their pockets. Boarding houses, controlled by the factories themselves, deducted food and housing straight from their wages. In the end, many were left with less than $1 a week in actual income. Think about that. $1 a week, after working 84 hours. With that reality, marrying a complete stranger in a territory thousands of miles away did not seem crazy. It seemed like a chance to survive. That was why so many women accepted the mail-order bride system. It was not romance. It was cold survival math. The correspondence market did not need to create desperation. It only had to find the people already living in it. Fact 20. A federal law regulating this industry only came in 2005. For more than 140 years, this industry operated with virtually no federal rules. The Mann Act of 1910 did try to deal with the trafficking of women across state lines, but it was full of loopholes and was almost never applied against matrimonial agencies. From the 1860s until the early 2000s, no federal government created real protections for the women who took part in this system. It took serious cases of abuse and even murders of foreign brides for Congress to finally act. Only in 2005 was the first law passed requiring criminal background checks on men and forcing agencies to disclose that information to women before any contact. In other words, for almost a century and a half, anyone could operate this kind of business without answering to anyone. Fact 21. Here is a fact that goes against everything we imagine. Mail-order marriages in the Old West had lower divorce rates than traditional marriages in eastern cities. Historian Christian Harzig studied marriage records in frontier territories and confirmed this with real data. But why did it work? The explanation is not romantic at all. These couples barely knew each other. There was no blind passion or fairy tale expectation. Both sides knew exactly what they were getting into. A survival partnership. They needed each other to get by in a place where everything was hard. Meanwhile, love marriages in big cities carried a huge weight of expectations. And when reality hit, disappointment came with it. In the end, it seems that low expectations were the real secret to keeping a marriage standing back then. Fact 22. More than 85% of them never went back. They stayed until they died. When these women arrived in the West in the 1870s and 1880s, many people expected it to be temporary. It was not. Census records and death certificates show that more than 85% stayed forever. They did not go back home. They were buried where they arrived. And what did they do in the meantime? They built towns, raised children, opened churches, founded schools. Without them, much of what we call the American frontier simply would not exist the way we know it. Hollywood told one version of this story, but in the movies, the men are the heroes. In real life, it was the women who kept everything running, while the men got the legends. The West was built on their backs, and most of us never knew that.